In the quiet suburb of Millbrook, where picket fences lined manicured lawns and children's laughter echoed through cul-de-sacs, a darkness lurked behind closed doors. This is the chilling true story of how one man's obsession spiraled into a horrific crime that would shatter the community's sense of safety forever. Sarah Thompson, a vibrant 38-year-old single mother, had recently moved to Millbrook with her 10-year-old daughter, Emily. They were starting fresh after Sarah's difficult divorce, hoping to find peace in this seemingly idyllic neighborhood. Little did they know that their arrival would set in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy. It was a warm summer day when Sarah and Emily first pulled up to their new home on Maple Street. The moving truck followed close behind, filled with the remnants of their old life. As they stepped out of the car, Sarah took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. She smiled down at Emily, whose bright blue eyes were wide with excitement. "What do you think, sweetie?" Sarah asked, running her hand through Emily's golden curls. Emily beamed up at her mother. "It's perfect, Mom. Can we go explore?" Sarah laughed, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she felt hopeful about the future. "Let's get settled first, then we can explore all you want." As they began unloading boxes, a tall, well-built man in his mid-40s approached from the neighboring house. He wore a friendly smile and carried a plate of chocolate chip cookies. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he called out, extending his hand to Sarah. "I'm Mark Peterson. I live next door." Sarah shook his hand, noting his firm grip and the warmth in his hazel eyes. "Sarah Thompson," she replied, "and this is my daughter, Emily." Mark's gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment before he turned to Emily, crouching down to her level. "It's nice to meet you, Emily. I hope you like chocolate chip cookies." Emily's face lit up as she looked to her mother for permission. Sarah nodded, and Emily eagerly accepted a cookie. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," Emily said between bites. "These are yummy." Mark chuckled, standing back up. "Please call me Mark. And if you need any help getting settled or want to tour the neighborhood, don't hesitate to ask." Sarah smiled politely. "That's very kind of you, Mark. We appreciate it." As Mark walked back to his house, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It seemed they had moved to a friendly neighborhood, just as she had hoped. Little did she know that behind Mark's charming facade lay a deeply troubled soul, harboring an obsession that would soon consume him entirely. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Emily fell into a comfortable routine in their new home. Sarah, a nurse at the local hospital, worked long shifts but always made time for Emily. They spent weekends exploring Millbrook, discovering hidden parks, quaint cafes, and a library that quickly became Emily's favorite spot. Mark, ever the helpful neighbor, found reasons to be around frequently. He offered to mow their lawn, brought over homemade dinners, and even fixed a leaky faucet in their bathroom. Sarah appreciated his kindness, but began to feel a slight unease at his constant presence. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch watching Emily play in the yard, Mark joined her with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said, handing her a glass. Sarah nodded, taking a sip. "It is. Millbrook has been everything we hoped for." Mark's eyes never left Sarah's face as he spoke. "I'm glad you're happy here. You know, I've lived in this house for 15 years, and I've never felt more at home than I do now." There was something in his tone that made Sarah shift uncomfortably. She changed the subject, asking about his work as an accountant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's interest in her was more than neighborly. As summer turned to fall, Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would appear in his yard whenever Sarah was outside, finding excuses to start conversations. He began leaving small gifts on her doorstep: flowers, books he thought Sarah might enjoy, toys for Emily. Sarah tried to maintain a polite distance, but Mark's persistence was becoming unsettling. She started to avoid being outside when she knew he was home, and she instructed Emily not to speak to Mark unless she was present. Emily, confused by the sudden change, asked her mother one night as they were getting ready for bed, "Mom, why can't I talk to Mr. Peterson anymore? Did I do something wrong? Sarah's heart ached at the innocent question. She sat on the edge of Emily's bed, pulling her daughter close. No, sweetie, you didn't do anything wrong. It's just, sometimes grown-ups need space, and we need to respect that. Emily nodded, but Sarah could see the confusion in her eyes. How could she explain to a 10-year-old the complexities of adult relationships and the gut feeling that something wasn't right? As October arrived, bringing with it a chill in the air and leaves of gold and crimson, Sarah's unease grew. She caught Mark watching her from his window more than once, and there was a new intensity in his gaze that sent shivers down her spine. One crisp Saturday morning, Sarah was raking leaves in the front yard when Mark approached, carrying a steaming mug of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her the mug. "It's getting cold out here." Sarah forced a smile, accepting the coffee out of politeness. "Thank you, Mark. That's thoughtful of you." Mark lingered, his eyes roaming over Sarah's face. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking. Emily's birthday is coming up soon, isn't it? I remember you mentioning it a while back." Sarah's grip tightened on the rake. She hadn't told Mark about Emily's birthday. "Yes, it is," she said cautiously. Mark's face lit up. "I have a great idea. Why don't I take her to the new amusement park that opened up in the next town? My treat. It could be an early birthday present." The suggestion sent alarm bells ringing in Sarah's head. She took a step back, putting some distance between them. "That's very kind, Mark, but we already have plans for Emily's birthday. Family only." Mark's expression darkened for a moment before he quickly recovered, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, I understand. Well, the offer stands if you change your mind." As he walked away, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She decided it was time to set clear boundaries with Mark, for her and Emily's sake. That evening, after tucking Emily into bed, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, composing an email to her sister, Kate. She detailed her concerns about Mark's behavior, feeling a sense of relief as she put her worries into words. "I don't want to overreact," she wrote, "but something doesn't feel right. He's always watching, always finding reasons to be around. Today, he knew about Emily's birthday without me ever telling him. I'm starting to feel like we're not safe here, Kate. Am I being paranoid?" As Sarah hit send, she didn't realize that her intuition was spot on. Across the yard, in the darkness of his study, Mark sat at his computer, scrolling through Sarah's social media profiles. He had memorized every detail of her life that he could find online, constructing an elaborate fantasy where he, Sarah, and Emily were a happy family. In Mark's mind, he and Sarah were meant to be together. He convinced himself that her polite smiles and thank yous were signs of deeper feelings, that her recent distance was just playing hard to get. But as the days passed and Sarah's avoidance became more apparent, Mark's fantasy began to crumble. He couldn't understand why Sarah couldn't see how perfect they would be together. In his delusion, he believed that Emily was the obstacle. If Emily weren't in the picture, Sarah would surely turn to him for comfort and support. They would bond over the tragedy, and Mark would be the hero who helped her through her grief. This twisted logic took root in Mark's mind, growing and festering like a malignant tumor. He began to plan, meticulously working out every detail of how he would remove Emily from the equation and finally have Sarah all to himself. On a chilly Wednesday evening in late October, Mark saw his opportunity. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway. He knew she worked late shifts at the hospital on Wednesdays. Emily would be home alone, likely doing homework or watching TV. Mark's heart raced as he approached the Thompsons' front door. He had a story prepared. His cat had gotten out, and he needed help searching for it. Emily, kind-hearted and always eager to help, would surely agree to assist him. He rang the doorbell, plastering on his most charming smile. When Emily answered, her face lit up with recognition. "Hi, Mr. Peterson. Mom's not home right now," she said, her voice cheerful but cautious, remembering her mother's warnings. Mark put on his best worried expression. "Hi, Emily. I'm actually here because I need your help. My cat, Whiskers, got out, and I can't find her anywhere. I was hoping you might help me look. We won't go far, I promise." Emily hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to help and following her mother's instructions. Mark sensed her uncertainty and quickly added, "We'll leave a note for your mom so she knows exactly where you are. It'll only take a few minutes, and I really appreciate your help." The mention of leaving a note seemed to ease Emily's concerns. She nodded, her compassion overriding her caution. "Okay, Mr. Peterson, let me just grab my jacket and write a note for Mom." As Emily disappeared into the house, Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. His plan was working perfectly. When Emily returned, jacket on and note left on the kitchen counter, Mark led her towards the woods that bordered their neighborhood. "I saw Whiskers heading this way earlier," he lied smoothly, guiding Emily deeper into the trees. As they walked, Emily chatted innocently about school and her upcoming birthday. Mark nodded along, his mind racing with what he was about to do. The weight of the knife in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step. They reached a small clearing, the fading daylight filtering through the autumn leaves. Mark stopped, turning to face Emily. "Mr. Peterson?" Emily's voice was small, a note of fear creeping in as she sensed something was wrong. "I don't see your cat. Maybe we should go back." Mark's expression changed, the mask of friendliness slipping away to reveal something cold and terrifying. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "but this is necessary. Your mom and I are meant to be together, and you're in the way." Emily's eyes widened in terror as she realized the danger she was in. She turned to run, but Mark was faster. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back as she screamed. The next few moments were a blur of violence and horror. Mark's rational mind shut down, replaced by a primal urge to eliminate what he saw as the obstacle to his happiness. When it was over, he stood over Emily's lifeless body, his hands shaking and clothes stained with blood. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, but instead of remorse, Mark felt a twisted sense of accomplishment. In his deluded mind, he had removed the barrier between him and Sarah. Now, he thought, she would need him more than ever. Mark carefully covered Emily's body with leaves and branches, making sure it was well hidden. He then made his way back to his house, slipping in through the back door to clean up and dispose of his bloody clothes. As night fell, Sarah returned home from her shift at the hospital. The house was quiet, too quiet. "Emily," she called out, expecting to hear her daughter's footsteps running to greet her. Silence answered. A knot of fear formed in Sarah's stomach as she searched the house, calling Emily's name with increasing desperation. When she found the note on the kitchen counter, her blood ran cold. "Mom, Mr. Peterson needed help finding his cat. We're looking in the woods. Be back soon. Love, Emily." Sarah's hands shook as she dialed 911. She knew, with a mother's instinct, that something terrible had happened. The next 3 days were a nightmare of frantic searches, police interviews, and growing despair. The entire community of Millbrook mobilized to find Emily. Search parties combed the woods. Helicopters circled overhead, and Emily's face was plastered on every local news channel. Through it all, Mark played the role of the concerned neighbor perfectly. He was always by Sarah's side, offering comfort and support, joining every search party. His apparent dedication to finding Emily only endeared him further to the community. But as the hours ticked by with no sign of Emily, Sarah's initial gratitude for Mark's support began to turn to suspicion. She noticed how his eyes never left her, how he seemed almost eager to comfort her. The memory of his increasingly obsessive behavior over the past months came flooding back, and a horrifying thought began to form in her mind. On the third day of the search, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local hiker, exploring an off-trail area of the woods, stumbled upon Emily's partially covered body. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and shattered Sarah's world completely. As the police swarmed the area, securing the crime scene and gathering evidence, Sarah fell to her knees in grief. Mark was there immediately, trying to hold her, to comfort her, but Sarah recoiled from his touch, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. The police investigation quickly zeroed in on Mark, his excessive involvement in the search, his obsessive behavior towards Sarah, and the note Emily had left mentioning him all raised red flags. When forensic evidence from the crime scene, fibers matching Mark's clothing and his DNA under Emily's fingernails, came to light, the case against him became overwhelming. Detectives brought Mark in for questioning, and under the weight of the evidence and his own guilt, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. In a chilling confession, Mark revealed the depths of his obsession and the horrific details of his crime. "I loved her," Mark said, his voice eerily calm as he spoke to the detectives. "Sarah was perfect, and we were meant to be together. But Emily, she was always there, always in the way. I thought if I removed her, Sarah would turn to me. We could be a family, just the two of us." The detectives listened in horror as Mark recounted how he had lured Emily into the woods, how he had ended her young life in a moment of delusional rage. His lack of remorse was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his confession. As news of Mark's arrest and confession spread, the community of Millbrook reeled in shock. How could this have happened in their quiet, safe neighborhood? How had they all been so blind to the monster living among them? The trial that followed was a media sensation. Mark's defense team attempted to paint him as mentally unstable, arguing for a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. But the prosecution's case was airtight. Testimony from neighbors about Mark's increasingly erratic behavior, coupled with the forensic evidence and his own confession, left little doubt of his guilt. Sarah took the stand during the trial, her testimony a heart-wrenching account of the months leading up to Emily's murder. She spoke of Mark's growing obsession, her increasing discomfort, and the guilt she felt for not acting on her instincts sooner. "I knew something wasn't right," she said, her voice breaking as she addressed the court. "But I didn't want to seem paranoid or unfriendly. I told myself I was overreacting. If I had just listened to my gut, maybe my little girl would still be alive." Her words struck a chord with everyone in the courtroom and with the millions following the trial on television. It was a stark reminder of the importance of trusting one's instincts and the potential consequences of prioritizing politeness over personal safety. As the trial progressed, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Several women from Mark's past came forward with stories of his obsessive behavior. Ex-girlfriends spoke of relentless pursuit after breakups, of feeling watched and stalked. Former neighbors recounted similar experiences of Mark's overwhelming friendliness, turning into something more sinister. These revelations led to the reopening of two cold cases in towns where Mark had previously lived. Both involved the disappearance of young girls, and while Mark was never officially charged, the similarities to Emily's case were undeniable. The implications were staggering. How had Mark managed to evade justice for so long? How many other victims might there have been? The case took on a new dimension as investigators began to piece together Mark's dark past. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution presented their closing arguments, painting a vivid picture of Mark's descent into obsession and violence. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the calculated way he had insinuated himself into Sarah and Emily's lives, and the utter lack of remorse he had shown. The defense, in a last-ditch effort, tried to argue that Mark's actions were the result of a severe mental illness, that he was not in control of his faculties when he committed the murder. But their arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence of Mark's lucidity and planning. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. As the judge read out the decision, a collective sigh of relief echoed through the courtroom. Sarah, sitting in the front row, closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. It was over, but the pain would never truly end. During the sentencing hearing, the judge didn't mince words. He described Mark's actions as heinous, calculated, and a betrayal of the basic trust that holds communities together. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again walk free among unsuspecting families. As Mark was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at Sarah one last time. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth and charm that had once fooled so many. Sarah met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. In that moment, she silently vowed that she would not let her daughter's death be in vain. In the days and weeks that followed the trial, Sarah found herself adrift in a sea of grief and guilt. The house on Maple Street, once a symbol of new beginnings, now felt like a mausoleum. Every corner held memories of Emily, her laughter echoing in the hallways, her artwork still pinned to the refrigerator, her unmade bed a stark reminder of a life cut tragically short. Sarah took a leave of absence from her job at the hospital, unable to face the daily reminders of her daughter's last days. She spent hours sitting in Emily's room, surrounded by stuffed animals and half-finished art projects, trying to make sense of a world that no longer included her little girl. Nights were the hardest. Sarah would wake in cold sweats, haunted by nightmares of Emily's final moments. In her dreams, she would run through endless woods, hearing Emily's cries but never able to reach her. She would wake up gasping, reaching for a daughter who was no longer there. The community of Millbrook, shaken to its core by the tragedy, rallied around Sarah. Neighbors brought food, offered words of comfort, and helped with practical matters. But their kindness was a double-edged sword for Sarah. Every act of neighborly support was a painful reminder of how she had once welcomed Mark's help, how she had allowed him into their lives. As the shock of the trial began to wear off, Sarah found herself consumed by a new emotion: anger. Anger at Mark for his unthinkable actions, anger at herself for not protecting Emily, and anger at a world that could allow such evil to exist. This anger became a driving force, pushing her out of the depths of her despair and towards a new purpose. Sarah began researching, spending hours online learning about predatory behavior, grooming tactics, and the warning signs she had missed. She reached out to victims' advocacy groups, seeking guidance and support. Slowly, a plan began to form in her mind. 3 months after the trial, Sarah stood before the Millbrook City Council, her voice shaking but determined as she addressed the assembled members and citizens. "My daughter, Emily, was taken from us because we, as a community, failed to recognize the danger in our midst," she began. "We prioritized politeness over protection, and a child paid the ultimate price. I'm here today to ensure that no other parent has to endure the pain I've experienced." Sarah proposed a comprehensive community safety program. It included educational workshops on recognizing predatory behavior, increased funding for background checks on new residents, and the establishment of a neighborhood watch program with direct lines of communication to local law enforcement. Her passion was contagious. The council members, many of whom had known Emily, were moved to tears by Sarah's strength and vision. The proposal passed unanimously, and work began immediately to implement Sarah's ideas. As news of Millbrook's initiative spread, Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight. What began as a local effort to improve community safety soon caught the attention of national media. Sarah was invited to speak at conferences, interviewed on major news programs, and consulted by other communities looking to implement similar programs. The quiet life she had once sought was gone, replaced by a relentless schedule of advocacy and education. At first, Sarah was overwhelmed by the attention. Public speaking had never been her forte, and the thought of sharing her painful story with strangers was daunting. But each time she stood before a crowd, each time she saw the impact her words had on others, she felt a little bit stronger. It was as if Emily was there with her, giving her the courage to continue. Sarah's first major speaking engagement was at a national conference on community safety in Chicago. As she stood backstage, waiting to be introduced, her hands shook and her heart raced. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths to calm herself. In her mind, she saw Emily's smiling face, heard her daughter's voice saying, "You can do it, Mom." When Sarah stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinded her. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the sea of faces before her. Police officers, community leaders, parents, all waiting to hear what she had to say. For a moment, she froze, the words catching in her throat. Then, She began to speak. "My name is Sarah Thompson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper at first. "And I'm here today because of my daughter, Emily." As Sarah shared her story, the move to Millbrook, Mark's growing obsession, and the tragic loss of Emily, the room fell silent. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on her every word. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The response to Sarah's speech was overwhelming. People lined up to speak with her afterward, sharing their own stories of loss and fear, thanking her for her bravery. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, but Sarah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since Emily's death. As Sarah's profile grew, so did the demands on her time. She found herself crisscrossing the country, speaking at town halls, police academies, and parent-teacher associations. Her message was always the same: vigilance, community, and the importance of trusting one's instincts. In Boston, she addressed a group of new police recruits, emphasizing the importance of taking every report seriously, no matter how small. "Emily told me she felt uncomfortable around Mark," Sarah shared. "I dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. Don't make the same mistake I did. Listen to the victims, even when they're too young to fully articulate their fears." In Los Angeles, she spoke at a conference for social workers and counselors. "Predators don't just groom their victims," she explained. "They groom entire communities. They make themselves indispensable, so no one questions their motives. It's up to all of us to recognize the signs and speak up, even when it's uncomfortable." In Seattle, she addressed a group of tech executives, challenging them to use their platforms to create safer online communities. "The internet has given predators new ways to reach our children," she said, "but it's also given us new tools to protect them. We need innovative solutions to keep our kids safe in the digital age." Each speaking engagement took its toll on Sarah. Reliving Emily's story night after night was emotionally exhausting. There were times when she wanted to give up, to retreat back into the quiet life she had once known. But every time she considered quitting, she would receive a letter or an email from someone whose life had been touched by her work. One such letter came from a mother in Ohio. "After hearing you speak," the woman wrote, "I recognized the warning signs in my daughter's soccer coach. I spoke up, and it turned out he had a history of inappropriate behavior with minors. You saved my daughter and countless others. Thank you for turning your pain into purpose." Messages like these kept Sarah going, even on her darkest days. They reminded her that her work was making a difference, that Emily's death was not in vain. As Sarah's advocacy work gained momentum, she found herself increasingly involved in policy discussions at the state and national level. She testified before Congress on the need for stricter background checks and community notification systems for sex offenders. She worked with state legislators to draft laws that would increase penalties for stalking and expand the definition of harassment to include more subtle forms of intimidation. One of Sarah's proudest achievements was the passage of Emily's Law in her home state. The law mandated comprehensive safety education in schools, teaching children from a young age about personal boundaries, the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong, and how to recognize grooming behaviors. It also established a statewide rapid response system for missing children, ensuring that resources could be mobilized quickly in the critical first hours after a disappearance. But even as she threw herself into her work, Sarah struggled with the weight of her loss. There were days when the pain was so overwhelming that she could barely get out of bed. On those days, she would visit Emily's grave, sitting for hours talking to her daughter, sharing her triumphs and her fears. "I miss you so much, sweetie," Sarah would say, tracing the letters of Emily's name on the headstone. "I hope you're proud of what we're doing. I hope you know how much you're loved, how many lives you're saving." These quiet moments at the cemetery became Sarah's refuge, a place where she could be vulnerable, where she didn't have to be strong for anyone else. It was here that she allowed herself to cry, to rage against the unfairness of it all, and to remember Emily not as a symbol or a cause, but as the vibrant, loving child she had been. As the years passed, Sarah's work began to show tangible results. Communities across the country implemented safety programs based on the Millbrook model. Reports of suspicious behavior increased, and several potential tragedies were averted because people were more willing to speak up when something didn't feel right. One such case occurred in a small town in Florida. A new neighbor had moved in and quickly ingratiated himself with the local families, offering to babysit and help with yard work. But one mother, who had attended one of Sarah's workshops, noticed some red flags in his behavior. She reported her concerns to the police, who discovered that the man was a convicted sex offender who had failed to register when he moved. I kept hearing Sarah Thompson's voice in my head, the mother later told reporters. She said to trust our instincts, that it's better to be wrong and apologize than to ignore a potentially dangerous situation. She was right. Stories like these both heartened and haunted Sarah. She was glad that her work was making a difference. But each averted tragedy was a painful reminder of what might have been if she had recognized the danger Mark posed sooner. As Sarah's influence grew, so did the backlash. There were those who accused her of fear-mongering, of creating a culture of suspicion that eroded community trust. Online trolls attacked her, calling her a grieving mother who had lost perspective. Some even suggested that she was exploiting her daughter's death for fame. These attacks hurt Sarah deeply, but she refused to be silenced. If being cautious means saving even one child from what happened to Emily, she would say, then I'll gladly bear the criticism. Sarah's resilience in the face of these attacks only served to increase her support. Other parents, advocates, and survivors rallied around her, forming a network of support that spanned the globe. This network became a powerful force for change, pushing for reforms and raising awareness about child safety issues. 5 years after Emily's death, Sarah found herself back in Millbrook for the unveiling of a memorial in the town's Central Park. The bronze statue depicted a young girl with curly hair, her face turned up towards the sky, a book clutched to her chest. It was Emily as she had been, and as she would always remain in the memories of those who loved her. As Sarah stood before the gathered crowd, she felt a mix of emotions: grief for the daughter she had lost, pride in the changes that had been made, and a deep, abiding love for the community that had supported her through the darkest days of her life. 5 years ago, we lost a bright light in our community, Sarah began, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. We lost my daughter, Emily, but in losing her, we found a strength we didn't know we had. We found a purpose that has guided us through the darkest of times. She gestured to the statue behind her. This memorial stands not just as a tribute to Emily, but as a promise that we will never again let evil hide in plain sight, a promise that we will always protect the innocent, always speak up when something doesn't feel right, always put the safety of our children above all else. As Sarah spoke, she noticed familiar faces in the crowd. There was Mrs. Johnson, Emily's third-grade teacher, who had helped establish a scholarship in Emily's name. There was Officer Rivera, who had been first on the scene the night Emily went missing and had since become one of the strongest advocates for community policing. And there in the back was Tom, the hiker who had found Emily's body. He had never sought recognition for his role in the case, but Sarah had insisted he be invited to the memorial unveiling. Each of you here today has played a part in Emily's legacy, Sarah continued. Whether you searched for her that terrible night, supported our family in the aftermath, or have since joined our fight to make our communities safer, you are all a part of this. Emily's light shines on through each of you. As Sarah's words rang out across the park, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. For a moment, just a moment, it felt as if Emily was there, smiling down on the community that had come together in her name. The unveiling of Emily's memorial marked a turning point for Sarah. While she continued her advocacy work, she also began to focus more on her own healing. She started seeing a therapist regularly, working through the complex emotions of grief, guilt, and anger that still plagued her. Sarah also began to reconnect with old friends and make new ones. She joined a support group for parents who had lost children to violent crimes, finding solace in the company of others who truly understood her pain. Slowly, she allowed joy back into her life, not to replace her love for Emily, but to exist alongside it. One unexpected source of comfort came in the form of a stray cat that began visiting Sarah's backyard. The cat, a scruffy orange tabby, would appear each evening as Sarah sat on her porch. At first, it kept its distance, watching her warily. But over time, it grew bolder, eventually allowing Sarah to pet it and even curling up in her lap. Sarah named the cat Phoenix, seeing in its resilience and ability to trust again a reflection of her own journey. Phoenix became a constant companion, a living reminder that even after unimaginable loss, it was possible to find warmth and connection again. As the years passed, Sarah's work evolved. While she continued to speak about community safety, she also began to focus more on healing and resilience. She wrote a book, After Emily, A Mother's Journey from Grief to Purpose, which became a bestseller and a source of comfort for countless readers dealing with their own losses. Sarah also established the Emily Thompson Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to child safety education and support for families affected by violent crime. The foundation provided scholarships, funded research into predatory behavior, and offered counseling services to survivors and their families. 10 years after Emily's death, Sarah stood once again before a crowd, this time at a national conference on resilience and healing. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt Emily's presence beside her, giving her strength. "We cannot change the past," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. "But we can learn from it. We can create communities where children are safe, where neighbors truly look out for one another, and where evil has nowhere to hide." This is Emily's legacy, and it's a legacy I invite all of you to share. As applause filled the auditorium, Sarah felt a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. She knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, that there would still be days when the pain of her loss would threaten to overwhelm her. But she also knew that every child protected, every predator exposed, every person who found the strength to keep going after unimaginable loss, these were all tributes to Emily's memory. The case of Mark Peterson and the murder of Emily Thompson had become more than just another true crime story. It had become a wake-up call, a catalyst for change in communities across the country. People had begun to look at their neighbors with new eyes, to trust their instincts, and to prioritize the safety of the vulnerable over social niceties. In prisons across the country, investigators continued to dig into Mark's past, uncovering a trail of obsession and violence that spanned decades. Cold cases were reopened, bringing closure to families who had long given up hope of ever knowing what happened to their loved ones. Mark Peterson, once the charming neighbor everyone wanted to befriend, now sat in a maximum security prison, a cautionary tale of the monsters that can hide behind friendly smiles. His case became required study for law enforcement officers and psychology students, a textbook example of how predators groom not just their victims, but entire communities. As for Sarah, she continued her tireless work, traveling the country, sharing Emily's story, and educating others on the importance of community vigilance. She never remarried or had more children. Instead, she devoted herself to protecting other people's children, ensuring that Emily's death would continue to save lives for years to come. The quiet suburb of Millbrook would never be the same. The case had shattered the illusion of safety that many suburban communities cling to. But from the ashes of tragedy, a stronger, more vigilant community had emerged. Neighbors looked out for one another with genuine care, rather than mere politeness. Parents were more attentive to their children's concerns, and more willing to speak up when something felt wrong. Emily's story had become a part of Millbrook's history, a somber reminder of the day their innocence was lost. But it had also become a source of strength, a rallying cry for a community determined to protect its most vulnerable members. 15 years after Emily's death, on what would have been her 25th birthday, Sarah stood once again before the bronze statue in Millbrook's Central Park. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, lines of both sorrow and laughter etched on her face. But her eyes still held the same determination, the same fierce love that had driven her all these years. A small crowd had gathered for the annual remembrance ceremony. Many were familiar faces, longtime supporters of Sarah's work, community members who had been there from the beginning. But there were new faces too, young parents with children who had never known a world without Emily's law and the safety measures it had put in place. Sarah looked out at the crowd, her heart full. 25 years ago today, my daughter Emily came into this world, she began. For 10 beautiful years, she filled our lives with joy and laughter. And for the past 15 years, even in her absence, she has continued to change lives and save others. She paused, collecting herself before continuing. I often wonder what Emily would be like today. Would she be in graduate school, starting a career, falling in love? These are questions I'll never have answers to. But I do know this. Emily's spirit lives on in every child who grows up safer because of the changes we've made. It lives on in every parent who trusts their instincts and speaks up when something doesn't feel right. It lives on in every community that comes together to protect its most vulnerable members. As Sarah spoke, a young woman made her way to the front of the crowd. Sarah recognized her immediately. It was Lily, the daughter of the woman in Florida who had reported her suspicious neighbor years ago. Lily was now a college student, studying criminal justice with the goal of becoming a victim's advocate. "Ms. Thompson," Lily said, her voice clear and strong, "I just wanted to thank you. Your work, Emily's story, it saved my life. And now, I want to dedicate my life to helping others the way you've helped so many." Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes as she embraced Lily. This was Emily's legacy, not just laws and safety measures, but real lives touched and changed. As she held the young woman, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. Emily was gone, but her light continued to shine brightly in the world. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Sarah remained by the statue. She placed a single rose at its base, just as she had done every year. "Happy birthday, my sweet girl," she whispered. "I love you, always." The sun was setting as Sarah finally turned to leave, casting a golden glow over the park. As she walked home, she felt a familiar presence beside her. Not the crushing grief of years past, but a warm, comforting presence. Emily was with her, as she always had been and always would be. Sarah Thompson's journey had been one of unimaginable pain and loss, but also of incredible resilience and transformative power. As she walked home from the memorial on what would have been Emily's 25th birthday, she reflected on the path her life had taken. The Emily Thompson Foundation, which Sarah had established 10 years after Emily's death, had grown into a nationally recognized organization. Its work spanned multiple areas, all aimed at creating safer communities and supporting those affected by violent crime. One of the foundation's most successful initiatives was the Emily's Eyes program. Inspired by the way Mark had manipulated the entire neighborhood, the program trained community members to recognize subtle signs of predatory behavior. It wasn't about creating a culture of suspicion, but rather fostering a community of awareness and mutual protection. Sarah remembered the first Emily's Eyes workshop she had conducted in a small town in Iowa. The community center had been packed, with people spilling out into the hallway. As she shared Emily's story and the lessons learned, she saw the dawning realization on people's faces. They began to share their own experiences. The neighbor who always offered to babysit for free, the coach who insisted on giving certain players rides home alone, the seemingly helpful stranger who always seemed to be around when children were present. By the end of the workshop, the atmosphere in the room had changed. People left not with fear, but with a sense of empowerment. They had tools now, knowledge that could protect their children and their community. The foundation also ran a scholarship program for survivors of violent crimes and their families. Every year, Sarah had the bittersweet task of reading through applications, each one a story of tragedy and resilience. There was a young man whose sister had been killed by a stalker, now studying psychology to help others heal from trauma. The woman who had survived a violent attack as a child, pursuing a law degree to advocate for victims' rights. Each scholarship awarded felt like a small victory against the darkness that had claimed Emily. As Sarah neared her home, she thought about the legislative changes her work had helped bring about. Emily's law had spread beyond her home state, with variations now enacted in 37 states across the country. The law not only mandated safety education in schools, but also established stricter guidelines for background checks in professions that involved working with children. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Congressman Robert Hernandez, a longtime supporter of her work. "Great news, Sarah," the message read. "The Enhanced Child Protection Act just passed the House. It's headed to the Senate next week. Couldn't have done it without your testimony. Emily continues to make a difference." Sarah smiled, a mix of pride and sadness washing over her. The Enhanced Child Protection Act would establish a national database for tracking patterns of suspicious behavior, allowing law enforcement agencies across the country to share information more effectively. It was a tool that might have saved Emily had it existed 20 years ago. As she entered her home, Sarah was greeted by Phoenix, now an elderly cat but still as affectionate as ever. She scooped him up, drawing comfort from his warm presence, as she had so many times over the years. Sarah made her way to her study, a room filled with mementos of her journey. Photos of Emily covered one wall. Emily on her first day of school, Emily playing soccer, Emily and Sarah baking cookies together. These were interspersed with images from Sarah's advocacy work. Speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers, working with survivors. On her desk sat a stack of letters, a small sample of the thousands she had received over the years. Sarah picked up the one on top, written in a child's careful handwriting. "Dear Miss Thompson," it read, "my name is Zoe. I'm 9 years old. We learned about Emily's law in school. I'm sorry about what happened to Emily, but I want you to know that because of her, I knew what to do when a man tried to get me to go with him at the park. I remembered what we learned and told my mom right away. The police caught him. Emily saved me. Thank you." Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes as she read the letter. This was Emily's true legacy. Not just a law or a foundation, but lives saved, children protected, communities strengthened. She sat down at her computer, opening the document she had been working on for months. It was a draft of her second book, tentatively titled Beyond the Headlines: The Lasting Impact of True Crime on Communities and Survivors. In this book, Sarah aimed to explore the ripple effects of high-profile crimes like Emily's murder. She interviewed survivors, family members, law enforcement officers, and community leaders, piecing together a comprehensive picture of how such tragedies reshape lives and societies. One chapter focused on the long-term impact on Millbrook. 20 years after Emily's murder, the town had become a model of community vigilance and support. The annual remembrance ceremony for Emily had evolved into a community safety fair, where alongside the solemn remembrance, there were workshops on self-defense, internet safety, and bystander intervention. Millbrook's crime rate had dropped significantly, not just for violent crimes, but across the board. Sociologists studying the town attributed this not to increased policing or harsh penalties, but to the strong community bonds that had formed in the wake of the tragedy. People looked out for each other in Millbrook, not out of fear, but out of a shared commitment to creating a safe and nurturing environment for all. Another chapter of Sarah's book dealt with the psychological impact on survivors and family members of victims. Sarah had interviewed dozens of people, including some who had lost loved ones to crimes similar to Emily's murder. One interview that stood out in Sarah's mind was with Maria Gonzalez, whose daughter had been killed by a family friend 10 years ago. Maria had fallen into deep depression after her loss, unable to work or even leave her house for months. "Your story saved me," Maria had told Sarah during their interview. "I saw you on TV, talking about Emily and the work you were doing. I realized that I had a choice. I could let my pain destroy me, or I could use it to make sure no other mother had to feel what I was feeling. That was the day I decided to live again." Maria had gone on to become a victims' rights advocate, working particularly with Spanish-speaking communities to break down cultural barriers that often prevented people from reporting suspicious behavior or seeking help after a crime. As Sarah worked on her book, she also reflected on the changes in how society dealt with true crime stories. In the immediate aftermath of Emily's murder, there had been a media frenzy. Sensationalist headlines, invasive reporters, and armchair detectives on internet forums had all added to the family's pain. But over the years, partly due to Sarah's advocacy, there had been a shift. More media outlets were now focusing on the systemic issues behind such crimes, the long-term impact on communities, and the work being done to prevent future tragedies. True crime was no longer just entertainment. It had become a vehicle for social change. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was a reminder about her appointment the next day. 20 years after Emily's death, Sarah had finally started seeing a therapist regularly. It had taken her a long time to realize that taking care of her own mental health was not a betrayal of Emily's memory, but a necessary step in continuing her work effectively. In her therapy sessions, Sarah had begun to unpack the complex emotions she had carried for so long. The grief that never fully went away, the guilt that still crept in during quiet moments, the anger that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. But she had also started to recognize her own strength, to acknowledge the good she had done, and to allow herself moments of joy without feeling like she was dishonoring Emily's memory. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about Mark Peterson. She had not allowed herself to think about him often over the years, focusing instead on Emily and the positive changes that had come from her tragic death. Mark was still in prison, serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. Over the years, as investigators had dug into his past, they had linked him to 3 other unsolved disappearances of young girls. The families of those girls had finally gotten answers, though the pain of their loss would never fully heal. Sarah had received a letter from Mark once, years ago. In it, he had expressed remorse for his actions, claiming that he had found God in prison and wanted her forgiveness. Sarah had read the letter once, then burned it. Her forgiveness was not something he had the right to ask for, and she refused to give him any more space in her life. Instead, Sarah had chosen to focus on the countless lives that had been positively impacted by the changes brought about in the wake of Emily's death. She thought about Lily, the young woman she had met at the memorial ceremony, now interning at the Emily Thompson Foundation while finishing her degree in criminal justice. Lily had become something of a protege to Sarah, bringing fresh ideas and youthful energy to the foundation's work. She had spearheaded a new initiative focused on internet safety, recognizing that the online world presented new challenges and dangers that hadn't existed when Emily was alive. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she picked up the framed photo of Emily that sat on her nightstand. It was her favorite picture, Emily at the beach, hair wild in the wind, laughing at something off camera. "We did good today, sweetie," Sarah whispered to the photo. "You did good. Sleep tight, my angel." In the years that followed, Sarah continued her work, though she began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the foundation, allowing younger advocates like Lily to take on more responsibility. She focused on writing, public speaking, and advising on child safety policies at the national level. Sarah never forgot Emily, never stopped missing her or wondering about the woman she would have become. But alongside the pain, there was now pride. Pride in the difference Emily's short life had made. Pride in the strength of the human spirit she had witnessed in survivors and their families. Pride in the communities that had come together to protect their most vulnerable members. The case of the obsessed neighbor who murdered to win a mother's love would forever be etched in the annals of true crime history. But more than that, it would be remembered as a turning point, a moment when one community's tragedy became a nation's wake-up call. It stood as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest threats are those hiding in plain sight, behind the mask of normalcy in our very own neighborhoods. But it also stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to a mother's endless love, and to the power of a community united in the face of unimaginable horror. Emily's light, once extinguished, now burned brighter than ever in the lives she continued to save and the communities she continued to transform. As Sarah Thompson looked back on the 25 years since she had lost her daughter, she realized that while the path had been unimaginably difficult, it had also been one of profound meaning and impact. Emily's death had created ripples that continued to spread, touching lives across the country and around the world. In the end, Mark Peterson's obsession had indeed changed Sarah's life forever, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of destroying her, it had given her a purpose. Instead of isolating her, it had connected her to a global community of advocates and survivors. And though the pain of losing Emily would never fully heal, Sarah had found a way to channel that pain into a force for good, a legacy that would far outlive the evil that had tried to destroy her. As night fell on Millbrook, the stars came out one by one, twinkling down on the quiet streets and well-lit homes. In windows across the town, soft lights glowed, a silent vigil for a little girl lost and a community forever changed. And in those lights, in the increased awareness, in the tighter bonds between neighbors, Emily lived on. Her story, tragic as it was, had become a beacon of hope, a call to action, and a lasting reminder that in the face of darkness, we all have the power to be a light. Yendi,